I wanted to use this passage from Numbers and focus on it a bit this morning. I'm hoping we all know the story of Acts that John also read for us when the Holy Spirit comes to all the disciples and the crowd that were there as followers. But this is a curious story from Numbers where Moses, leading up to this story, the people were complaining that they didn't have any meat and they're longing for the days that they were back in Egypt, as they're traipsing across the desert. And they're saying, all we've got is this rubbishy manna and, we grind it up and turn it into bread and it's boring. And we'd love to have some of the fish we used to have back in Egypt. And, do you remember that? And the pots and and they're going on like this. Well, Moses, while they're crying out to God, for some meat, Moses is crying out to God saying, oh man, are these all my kids? These aren't my family. Why do I have to look after them and bring them through the desert? This pack of whingers, thousands of them, it's too much for me. And it's really a wonderful story because God hears both of those prayers, the right ones and the wrong ones, and God answers them. But where we pick up, God is addressing Moses' prayer. That it's too much for him. It's too much work for him. He's the designated leader of this enormous cast of people, and he's not coping. And so God says, well, call 70 elders and bring them to the tent. You remember the tent that we looked at last week? So they all gather around the front of that tent where God's presence lived, if you like, and where God spoke to the people. And he said, bring the 70 there and I will speak to you. And he does. And God then takes a portion of the Spirit that he gives and that he put on Moses, and he divvies it up among these 70 leaders, that they would now be leaders, that they would now be Moses' helpers and look after, groups of people for him. And then this funny thing happens. There's a couple of elders that are, sick or whatever. They've got a bit of a frog in their throat, so they stay back in the camp and they don't come to the tent that day, even though they were supposed to be there. And I don't really know whether they were replaced by another two or whether they were too short. We're not told those details, but they were supposed to be there. But they weren't. And God's Spirit is put on them. And out in the camp, they start prophesying. They start speaking about all that God's done. They start praising God and, pointing out to people what God is doing in their midst. And some little kid thinks, oh my goodness, what's going on? This is crazy. They're not supposed to be doing that. That's the sort of stuff that Moses does for us. So he runs off to Moses. He says, Papa, there are people out there and they're prophesying. They're not supposed to be doing that. And Moses' age says, you need to stop them. And there's a very similar story in the Gospels when this happens to Jesus. In essence, they complain. Moses' aide, he says, stop them. We can't have, unlicensed and non-accredited people speaking out and preaching and talking about God over there in the campsite. We have no idea who they are. This week it's Eldad and Medad, and next week it'll be my kids or your kids. It could be anybody. Imagine. It'd be crazy. And Moses just probably rolls his eyes and looks to heaven and says, I wish that all the Lord's people would be prophets. And that all the Lord's people would have his Spirit in them. And they'd all be talking about all the good things that God has done for us. And that story in Acts is when God makes that happen. When God makes Moses' wish come true. When we receive the Holy Spirit, when those disciples receive the Holy Spirit like that in a wind and in the fire that comes to them, it's the fulfillment of all that Moses was longing for. And Peter, as you remember, gets up and preaches to them, and he reminds all the people there, not of this passage in Numbers when Moses is longing for it, but in another passage in Joel, that they would all know well, when God tells Joel, in those days to come, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. And your old men and your old women, they're going to start prophesying. And the young ones, the little kids, they're going to be prophesying. And everyone in between would receive a dose of my Spirit. You see, it's the day that they've been longing for. But when it comes, sometimes we don't quite appreciate it. Yesterday, David and I were at Presbytery, and we spent hours talking about how we train ministers for leaders. As you know, we're going through a bit of a reshuffle of how we do the training of a minister, for ordained minister, particularly, but all of the ways we train people leading up to that. The shorter courses, if you like, the ways that we train people to do parts of ordained ministry, even if it's not going to be full-time. And we were struck a little bit by the notion that it costs the church about, $450,000 a year? $450,000 to train a minister from start to finish. And it usually takes about 5 years. And the trouble being that we only have, that's not the worst part. The worst part is we only have a few of them. It's sort of the reverse of the prison food. It's terrible and there's not enough of it. It's like that. It costs us way too much, and we don't have nearly enough people doing it. That's sort of the story with our training. And so we're talking about, how do we do this better? How do we, do what we need to do and train people to do this work in a way that's better and that's affordable and that suits this changing church in which we are a part and we live? And I couldn't help but think it's the same dilemma that was presented to Moses. How do we license and accredit people to talk about God and to speak out about the good things that God is doing in our midst? The easy answer is we let the Holy Spirit do that. It's the power of God's Spirit working in all of you that should enable all of you to be God's prophets. We're all prophets for God. We're all charged with and given the power to speak out about what God is doing. What I like in Joel's passage is that it points out that, those people right at the top of the spectrum, those older people in retired villages and old folks' homes, and the little kids, the people who often have no voice politically, who are pushed off to the sides of being, well, you guys are too old, you've done your dash, you're past it, and you guys don't know anything, you're too young, so we don't need to listen to those ends of the spectrum. He says those are the people that are going to be prophesying. People that didn't have voices, the poor people and the homeless people, they're going to be prophesying of what God is doing in their midst. I wish all God's people were prophets. In many ways, I think I actually have the easier job. Despite all the training and whatnot, I get to preach to you guys. You're pretty friendly. You guys have to preach now in your workplaces and, at the construction site and on the production line and in the office and the schools. They can be rough crowds. every day you're called to be prophesying for God. That's what the Holy Spirit is given to us for. It's not given that we can improve our lives, that we can make ourselves, more powerful prayers necessarily. Acts and Pentecost was the birth of the church because people spoke out about what God was doing in their life. And it wasn't just that Peter stood up and preached to the crowd, this sort of a role. It wasn't about that. It was about all the people of God speaking out about what God had done. And it got me thinking about the conversations that I hear of when you guys are doing that. You remember that Peter, only a few weeks earlier, is denying Jesus, denying he had anything to do with him, denying that he knew this guy or was a part of the crowd following him, denies all of that. But the Holy Spirit comes into his life, and all of a sudden he's preaching to crowds. And he's eloquent, and he's got the words to say. He knows what he needs to get across to these people to tell them about the love of God that's come to them in Jesus Christ. It's a radical conversion. It's a radical change in just a matter of weeks, isn't it? So, there's something in the power of God's Spirit that we need to have. We want to have a part of that. I remember conversations that I've heard, and I know you've had, with friends, family, out on the streets, in your workplaces, about refugees and people coming into our wonderful country. And the current culture is one of fear. And I know it's you people who stand up and put across a culture of compassion, that sow a seed in other people's minds that love is more powerful than fear. And while bringing somebody here doesn't fix the problems that they ran from, that's the crucial part. But that doesn't mean that we should not be loving, compassionate people. And I'm thinking of conversations where people are talking about, can you believe how much lotto is this week? It's $20 million or it's $30 million. And where are those conversations of people of faith? People who are grateful and know what God's given them and can say, I've already won lotto. I don't need $30 million. I don't need $20 million because I live in the best place in the world and I've got a family that loves me and I've got a home and I've got food and I know what I'm doing in my life or where I'm going, and I have God with me. I don't need to worry about $4 million or $30 million or whatever it might be. And I think about you prophesying to all that God has done in your life, in those normal scenarios, across coffee, in an office, working in the garden, wherever it might be. You, the people of God, prophesying to what God has done. That is the work of the Holy Spirit. The work of the Holy Spirit was not that we could have 10 or 15 people converted by Peter's sermon, or even that there are 500 people converted by Peter's sermon. The work of the Holy Spirit was to get Peter to speak out about what God had done. Do you see the difference? It's not about me being up here, being able to preach to you about the love of God. It's about you people being able to preach the love of God in real scenarios, about refugees or about winning lotto or about where you spend your money, or all of those conversations, they're prophetic conversations that tell people who don't know about God that God is important to you and that God's love has changed the way you live. So I guess my question is, have you been letting God's Spirit work in you? Have you been letting God's Spirit work in and through those conversations? Are you listening to that rustling of the wind of God's Spirit as it blows into your life? Because it's quiet in those conversations, isn't it? You have to be deliberate about listening to God sometimes, to hear what the Spirit might want you to say, to let the response be one of compassion rather than just rubbish or the rest of the things that people want to hear. When was the last time you had one of those conversations? And can you recognise the Holy Spirit that was blowing then? As you said something maybe courageously, truthfully, even though it was unpopular. The reality is, friends, I am not this community's resident prophet or any of those things. The reality is that you are. We all are. We're all given God's Spirit and we all have good news to share. I wish that all God's people were prophets. Wouldn't Moses love to have seen this crowd of people and look out on you and think, you've all got the Spirit. You are all God's prophets, so go out and prophesy. Amen.